Hey guys, you only have to listen to me talk today and next week, and that's it. Today we are going to get through voting campaigns and elections, and next week we'll do media, power, and political communication. Your fourth and final quiz is posted as well, and then your essay will be due on the final day of class, which is Monday, November 29th. All of your instructions have been posted for that. I've had a few questions sent to me about that. Happy to answer questions, but it should be pretty self-explanatory. And then your final exam will be due on the final day of class because I have to get grades in. So I will post it on November 29th. It will be due on December 6th. I'll post some information about that, but your final exam will be due on December 6th so that we can get grades in and have the semester finished up. I mentioned this last week, but please email me if you are missing any assignments, if you're missing any quizzes, if you're missing any exams. I am happy to work with you about getting that fixed because I know doing this virtually is difficult. So please email me and we will see what we can do about getting that fixed for you. I'm not going to write that down. So if you're watching the video, you know, and those of you who are watching the videos probably are already caught up anyway, but thanks for your participation this semester. It really makes a big difference. All right. Today we are going to talk about voting campaigns and elections. Actually interesting because it's the Electoral College, and this is something that's still communicated and about in the media all the time. So we'll kind of dive in. So in 2016, something happened that has only happened 4 times in history, happened for the second time in 20 years. A candidate who trailed in the national polls, averaged for the entire cycle, who continued to trail in the popular vote, was about to win the presidency. Donald Trump was about 1 million or more popular votes behind Hillary Clinton, but he was elected president. The Electoral College is crazy, guys. Democrats really felt disenfranchised. The crowds took to the streets to protest the elections. Republicans were thrilled because this is twice that they felt that the system that was sometimes rigged against them had given them the presidency. 3 of the last 7 elections, though they had only won the popular vote in 1 of them. How crazy. The Electoral College is kind of the appendix of American politics, right? It's an organ you don't really need anymore, and it's generally quiet and unobtrusive, so you don't realize it's even there. But when it gets inflamed, it's really painful, and if it bursts, it threatens a system-wide failure. It's never threatened the life of our republic, but it has posed a crisis of legitimacy. Our founders really faced a dilemma about how the executive of the new republic should be chosen. In the days after Shays' Rebellion, the founders were full of doubt about the wisdom that the people could be counted on to exercise. They didn't trust their common man. Direct popular election of a president felt too risky. They could pick someone who wouldn't demonstrate the wisdom and stability. The South would rebel because slaves were not citizens and could not vote, so the North would always have the population advantage. But the alternative of giving Congress the ability to choose the executive, like in Parliament, meant doing away with this cherished principle of separation of powers. So there came the Electoral College. It seemed to be one of those compromises that worked so well for them throughout the Constitution writing process. The Electoral College would have electors chosen at the state level, originally by the state legislators who had been elected by the people, and eventually by the people themselves. The number of electors awarded to each state would be based on the number of representatives that that state had in Congress, House plus Senate. So this removed any objections the South had, since they had already decided slaves counted as 3/5 of a person for determining how many representatives a state received. So electors would cast votes for the president based on their independent judgment about who would be the best presidential candidate. In Federalist number 68, Hamilton wrote, "A small number of persons selected by their fellow citizens from a general mass will be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to such complicated tasks." Since our founding, though, our ideas about democracy have changed. We no longer see the people as the threat to the stability that the founders were worried about. We've introduced more popular control into our political process. We amended the Constitution to directly elect senators when they once were chosen by state legislatures. So the entire Congress is now directly elected by the people. The Electoral College has evolved a little bit. In the early 1800s, the states figured they would have more leverage if, rather than voting independently, their electors all voted the same way. When they began casting votes for the popular vote winner in the state, the founders who felt this violated the check provided by independent electors were dismayed. There were some unorthodox election results that ensued when states were using different methods of elector selection, including Andrew Jackson winning both the popular vote for the presidency and the Electoral College in 1824 and still losing the presidency in the House of Representatives. By the late 1800s, all states were choosing their electors, though, by popular vote. So even with electors popularly chosen, the matter of how to distribute them remains, and that too is up to states. Today, all but 2 states give all of their votes to the popular winner in their state. Maine and Nebraska use a system based on congressional districts. So it's funny when you see the results coming in on election night, Maine and Nebraska look different. Ironically, the winner-take-all distribution of electoral votes generally exaggerates the advantage of the winner, turning an even slight popular vote lead into a landslide in the Electoral College. In 2000 and in 2016, it had a different and almost anti-democratic consequence. Hillary Clinton said of Al Gore's loss in the year 2000, "I believe strongly that in a democracy, we should respect the will of the people, and to me, that means it's time to do away with the Electoral College and move to the popular election of our president." In 2012, Trump called the Electoral College a disaster for our democracy, and then it won him the presidency later on. Changes to the Electoral College have been proposed. They include creating a contract among states controlling at least 270 electoral votes. Then they would cast their votes for the popular vote winner. This was enacted in 11 states, controlling 165 electoral votes, and it's pending in several others, but it's only pending and the Electoral College remains. Why do we still have this archaic institution whose original purpose has been lost to history? What's at stake in keeping the Electoral College? If I were in person with you guys, we would divide the class in half and have a debate about this because it's so interesting, I think. So feel free to debate amongst yourselves about why we should keep the Electoral College, or why should we do away with it? We pride ourselves on a democratic government, but we have this love-hate relationship with the idea of voting and campaigns. A lot of citizens believe that elections don't accomplish anything, that elected officials ignore the wishes of the people, and the government is rigged to benefit the elite at the expense of the many. Only about half of the eligible electorate vote. You guys, if you've listened to me at all, you know I think voting is so incredibly important. As soon as you're able, please go vote. Don't let this be true. When we choose a leader to make a decision, pick the captain of the football team, decide where to eat dinner, our first instinct is to call for an election. Other ways of deciding may be picking the oldest, the wisest, the strongest, holding a lottery, asking for volunteers. But Americans love an election, so we have a lot of elections. We just had one. We're still in the midst of one in Columbia right now. They're having a runoff. Voting in a democratic society. So up until the last 100 years, it was virtually unimaginable that the average citizen would have any say in who would govern. Leaders would be chosen by birth, by church, by military might, by the church leaders, but not by the mass public. Real political change was usually ushered with violence and bloodshed. Americans and other citizens around the world are now buying into the narrative that government with the consent of the governed is superior to government imposed on unwilling subjects, and that political change is best accomplished through the ballot box rather than on the battlefield or in the streets. The mechanism that connects citizens with their government, by which they signify their consent and through which they accomplish peaceful change, is elections. Elections are an amazing invention. They provide a method for the peaceful transfer of power. Radical political changes can take place without blood being shed. This would have confounded most of our political ancestors. But how much power should citizens exercise over government? Elite theorists believe that citizens should confine their role to choosing among competing elites. Pluralists think citizens should join groups that fight for their interests in government on their behalf. Participatory Democrats call for more active and direct citizen involvement in politics. Each of these views has a consequence for how an election should be held. How many officials should be chosen by the people? How should elections be held? Should people choose officials directly or through representatives to whom they elect? How accountable should officials be to the people who elect them? Who should be allowed to vote? The founders were really of two minds. The Constitution reflects their fears that people could not reliably exercise wise and considered judgment about politics. So the founders built this remarkable layer of insulation between the national government and the will of the people. The president was to be elected not directly by the people, but by an electoral college, which is supposed to be a group of wiser than average men who would use prudent judgment. It's an intermediary body that elects the president. Only the House was popularly elected at the time. Founders thought that the government needed the support of the masses, but they could not afford to be led by what they saw as the public's short-sighted and easily misguided judgment. Despite our founders' reluctance to entrust much political power to the American citizens, we have since altered our method of electing senators to make these elections direct, and the Electoral College almost always endorses the popular vote for the president. Elections fulfill a variety of functions in modern democratic life: selecting leaders, giving direction to policy, developing citizenship, informing the public, containing conflict, legitimizing and stabilizing our system. Are the elections the best way to choose a wise and capable leader? Can we trust the average citizen to make the wise choices in the voting booth? Recent critics focus on the other side of the equation. Democratic elections often fail to produce the best leaders because the electoral process scares off some of the most capable candidates. Running for office is hard, expensive, and bruising. The simple truth is that elections only ensure that the leader chosen is the most popular on the ballot. There's no guarantee that the best candidates will even run or be chosen. It's only partially about choosing able leadership. Elections are intended to keep leaders responsive to the concern of the governed. They can be voted out if the voters are displeased. Policy direction is indirect. We elect people and they promise to enact policies, but we don't vote on actual policies at the national level. The voice of the people is muted and modulated. Occasionally, elections produce marked shifts in public policy. The New Deal hands-on approach versus the previous administration's hands-off approach. Elections, though, do achieve a remarkable consistency between the general preferences of the citizens and the kinds of policies that states enact. Members of Congress are really responsive to the overall policy wishes of their constituents, and if they're not, they lose their jobs. Elections also speed up the process by which changes in public preferences for a more activist or less activist government are systematically translated into patterns of public policy. Participation in government is valuable for citizens, and elections help citizens feel fulfilled and effective. When people are unable to participate in politics, their sense of political efficacy suffers. Political efficacy is their citizens' feelings of having of effectiveness in political affairs. People who participate more feel more powerful and have a higher sense of political efficacy. Another important function of elections is to educate the public. Despite the circus of campaigns, a campaign is a time of deliberation when alternative viewpoints are aired and openly, so citizens can judge truth and desirability about competing claims. We probably do know and understand more about our government because of our electoral process than we would be without free and competitive elections. You probably do learn things from these crazy commercials we see. Elections limit our options for political influence. If they help us reduce our political conflicts to electoral contests, they also operate as a kind of safety valve for citizen discontent. There's always a way for unhappy citizens to vent their energy. Elections can replace parties, but they don't fundamentally alter the underlying character of our system. Without elections, citizens might turn to more threatening behaviors like boycotts, protests, civil disobedience, rebellion. It's important for elections to make political outcomes acceptable to participants. By participating, we implicitly accept and thereby legitimize results. The genius here is that participation makes political results acceptable even to those who lose. Most people who lose shrug their shoulders and just wait for the next chance to elect candidates whose policies are more to their liking. Except for this year. What if we don't vote? Does it matter? I think so. Would election outcomes be different if non-voters were to participate? Would higher levels of non-voting indicate that our democracy is not healthy? It's unclear whether or not it would be more beneficial to one party or the other if more people voted. Low voter turnout might not affect who wins the election, but elections do more than simply select a leader. Non-voting can influence the stability and legitimacy of our democratic government. The victor governs our country, but as little as 25% of the eligible electorate may have voted for the winner. Politicians are more attentive to the voice of voters and contributors, and failure to participate politically can aggravate these already low feelings of efficacy and produce higher levels of political estrangement. Even without being well-informed and following campaigns closely, Americans still cast intelligent votes reflecting their best interests, but barely half of the adult population votes in presidential elections. And in off-year elections, primaries, state elections, rates of participation drop even lower. Should ill-informed voters stay home? No. How should we make voting easier? One factor with significant impact on whether people exercise their right to vote is the legal obstacle course they face. Election rules define who can vote and how easy it will be for those eligible to vote to actually do so. In most countries, the government takes responsibility for requiring you to register to vote. And in some, voting is required by law, so turnout's very high. The United States has regulations that have put a brake on voting participation by making registration a burdensome activity and by making voting more difficult than it is in other places. We have election rules that act as a set of valves that make it harder for people to vote. Even people who are deeply committed to democratic norms debate whether voting ought to be made so easy that uninformed voters go to the polls. Some think voters should pass some minimum threshold of involvement in the system and the existence of some hurdles in the form of registration laws and limited voting opportunities, which helps to weed out those who really don't know as much about the issues or candidates that they're voting for. Those who reject this idea say that everyone's obligated under the law and they should have easy access to making that law, and that individuals might not know the nuances of public policy, but they do know their own interests best. Who should be encouraged to vote? It's not so much what's good for democracy as a whole, rather than what's most beneficial to each political party. The debate has become how easy should it be to exercise one's right to vote instead of being fought over philosophical grounds about the nature of democracy. This has become a partisan power struggle. In 1993, Congress passed the Motor Voter Act, which was legislation that allows you to register to vote at the same time you apply for a driver's license or another state benefit. Every reform marginally has increased the number of people voting, but the results as a whole are still really disappointing. There are a lot of constitutional amendments that set fundamental voting protections based on race and gender and age. And then federal legislation like the Motor Voter Act is the law of the land. But the Constitution gives the states the primary responsibility for determining how elections are held, how early and where to register, whether early voting by mail is permitted, how long polls are open. These are all made at the state level, and over time we've seen substantial fluctuations in how easy various states make it for citizens to exercise their constitutional right to vote. Some state laws have been passed that require various forms of ID, and these cut back on the existing trend of permitting early voting. Almost half the states have voting restrictions, including various voter ID requirements. Restrictions of voter registration drives, eliminating election day requirements, and cutting back on opportunities for early voting. Republicans insist that these measures are intended to reduce voter fraud. Political observers, activists, politicians, and political scientists worry about the extent of non-voting in the United States. When people don't vote, they have no choice in choosing their leaders. Their policy preferences are not registered. They don't develop as an active citizen. And some observers feel that their abstention signals an alienation from the political process. Survey data tells us that older citizens vote at higher rates than younger ones, and gender makes a difference. Since 1984, women are voting at higher levels than men, and the likelihood of voting steadily goes up with income and education. Racial and ethnic minority groups participate at a lower level. Some groups have much better representation than others. The upshot is that our elected officials are indebted to and hear much more from the higher socioeconomic ranks in society, and they don't hear much from the low participation kind of have-nots as often. So choosing whether and how to vote. Voting varies dramatically in its importance to different citizens. For some, it's a significant aspect of their identity as a citizen. 87% of people think it's a very important obligation, though only about half of those people actually vote. If we do vote, a number of considerations go into our decision making, including our partisan ID, our social group membership, gender, race, ethnicity, stance on issues, evaluation of the job that the government is doing, our opinion of the candidates. Deciding whether and how to vote is very complex. Some of the low voter turnout is accounted for by changes over time and psychological orientations or attitudes towards politics. If people feel that the government is corrupt, the system is rigged, or they can't make a difference, they won't vote. Turnout was down after Watergate. Obama ran on a cleaner and less partisan politics, and turnout was higher. Lower voter turnout could be because of the change in efforts in direct contact during election campaigns. There's something called voter mobilization. It's a party's efforts to inform potential voters about issues and candidates and persuade them to vote. This can be making phone calls, knocking on doors, supplying rides to the polls. Both parties invest heavily in GOTV, get out the vote efforts that have led to increased participation. But some of the decline is due to larger societal changes, social connectedness, citizens' involvement in their groups, and relationships to their communities and families. People are increasingly leaving the communities where they grew up. They live alone, they maybe join fewer groups, they lose ties to the larger community and have less stake in participating. There are expressive benefits to voting. It feels good to do what we think we're supposed to do or to help the causes we believe in. And we get social rewards from our politically involved friends from voting. I'll tell you now, great job. Thanks for voting, guys. Deciding who to vote for is really shaped by our party loyalty and group identity as much by the candidates and the positions they take. The single biggest factor accounting for how people decide to vote is party identification. Social group characteristics can exaggerate or override traditional party loyalties. And the impact of gender is really unclear. There's a gender gap on positions men and women takes, which leads a lot more women to support Democrats, but married women are more conservative than single women. Ideally, a highly attentive citizen would pay careful attention to the different policy positions offered, and then perhaps aided by informed policy analysis from the media, they cast their votes for the candidates who best represent their preferred policy solutions. But we're not ideal, and the role played by issues is less obvious and more complicated. It's limited by some of these factors, like we're busy, and sometimes we rely on party labels to tell us what we need to know. We know where we stand on easy issues, maybe like gay marriage, but other issues are harder. Some citizens tune out the more complicated issues or fail to vote in their own interest. Maybe the media doesn't cover issues in depth. They prefer to focus on the horse race aspect of who is ahead. The people process a lot of policy relevant information in terms of their impressions of the candidate rather than as policy information. They can't necessarily articulate an opinion and preference on policy. This idealized model of policy voting is called perspective voting. It's basing decisions on a well-informed opinion and consideration of the future consequences of what a given vote will happen. Most voters supplement their spotty policy information with their evaluation of how they think the country is doing and how the economy has performed and how well the incumbents have carried out their job. This is called retrospective voting, basing your decision on a reaction to past performances, approving the status quo or a desire for change. Like Reagan asked, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" And politicians have been reprising that question ever since. It's easy decision making because you only have to ask how have things been going as a guide to whether or not to support the current party in power. Voters also base decisions on judgments about the candidates as individuals. Is this a beauty or personality contest? Not always. Voters form clear opinions about candidate qualities that are relevant to governing, such as trustworthiness, competence, experience, sincerity. Voters don't decide in isolation. Each campaign works hard to define its own candidate in positive terms and create a negative narrative about the opponent. Being president's hard, but so is getting the job. So when you think you want to run for president one day, you have to think about coming up. Each party has to choose a single viable candidate. How the candidate's chosen will determine the sort of candidate chosen. In politics, the rules are always central to shaping the outcome. Prior to 1972, primary election results were mostly kind of beauty contests because their results were not binding. But since 1972, party nominees for the president have been chosen in primaries, taking away from the party elite and giving it to the activist members of the party who care enough to turn out and vote in party primaries. There are several crucial steps between the wishful thinking and actually running for the nomination. First, you want to test the waters unofficially. Talk to your friends. See how much support you can count on. Maybe leak the news to the media. This is called the invisible primary. Early attempts to raise money, line up campaign consultants, generate media attention, and getting commitments for support even before candidates announce they're running. If the first step goes well, then you'll file with the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, to set up a committee to receive funds so they can officially explore their prospects. This is an exploratory committee, a committee formed to determine the viability of one's candidacy for office. It also takes a lot of money for a candidate to be taken seriously. Those with pre-primary funds are most likely to win. The potential candidate is going to use the pre-primary season to position himself as credible with the media. Incumbents have a lot of advantage here because they already have a relationship with the media. And then there's going to be an official announcement of candidacy. Promises are made to supporters, agendas are set, media attention is captured, and the process is underway. The actual fight for the nomination takes place in the state party caucuses and primaries. A caucus is a local gathering of party members to choose the convention of delegates. Party caucuses are where grassroots members of the party in each community gather to discuss the current candidates. They vote from the delegates who will be sent to the national convention. But most states hold primaries. I think there's still 15 that hold caucuses. The most common device for choosing a delegate for the National Convention is still the presidential primary. This is an election by which voters choose convention delegates to committed to voting for a certain candidate. They can be either open or closed, depending on rules that change from year to year. Any registered voter can vote in an open primary. We've talked about this before. It's a primary election where eligible voters don't have to be registered party members. At the polling place, they say, do you want a Republican ballot or a Democrat ballot? Or a closed primary is where only the registered party members can vote. Democrats then generally use a method of proportional representation where the candidates get the percentage of delegates equal to the percentage of the primary vote they win. Republican rules from proportional representation to a winner-take-all. State primaries also vary when they're held, with various states engaging in what's called front-loading, the process of scheduling presidential primaries early in the primary season. South Carolina is the first in the South, and we get a lot of media attention from that. We have a lot of presidential candidates visiting our state early on in campaign seasons. By tradition and state law, Iowa and New Hampshire are the first contests for delegates, so they always are going to get a lot of attention. A front runner, of course, is the leading candidate and expected winner of a nomination. An early front runner status garners a candidate a lot more media coverage. A chief goal of a candidate's campaign is to control the narrative and not let the media take it over. You want momentum, the widely held perception that a candidate's gaining electoral strength. Since 1972, delegates attending the National Convention have not had to decide on who the party's nominee would be, but there are two official actions that take place at conventions. The parties approve their platforms, and the vice president is officially named. So then there's the general election campaign. After the candidates are nominated in late summer, there's a tiny break before the fall campaign, where the campaign really begins. Most of the presidential battle, though, is for swing voters, the approximate 1/3 of the electorate who are undecided at the start of the campaign. The logic is to win the general elections, campaigns move away from the sharp ideological tone used to motivate the party faithful in the primaries and to kind of run to the middle, making less idealized appeals. The presidential election, though, is not a national race. It's a race between the candidates in each of the 50 states and D.C., and the reasons for the Electoral College's existence may seem outdated, but it drives campaign strategy. The Constitution provides, I mentioned this earlier, for each state to have as many electoral votes as it does for senators and representatives in Congress. So Alaska has 3 electoral votes, one for each of the state senators and one for its sole member of the House. California has 55 electoral votes, 2 for the 2 senators, and there are 53 members of the House. The 23rd Amendment gave D.C. 3 electoral votes. So there are 538 electoral votes in all. The 435 members of the House, plus the 100 members of the Senate, plus for the 3 from D.C. equals 538. The electors are generally activist members of the party whose presidential candidate carried the state. The importance of the Electoral College is that in all states but Maine and Nebraska operate on a winner-take-all basis. So thus, the winner in California, even if he or she has less than a majority of the popular votes, wins all 55 electoral votes. The loser may have won 49% of the popular vote but gets nothing in the Electoral College. So it's possible for the popular vote winner to lose in the Electoral College. This has only happened 3 times in history, most recently in 2000 and 2016. Usually the opposite happens. The Electoral College exaggerates the candidate's victory. The rules of the Electoral College gives greater power to some states over the others. And over the years, there have been hundreds of bills introduced in Congress to reform or abolish the Electoral College. They say it's undemocratic because it's possible for the popular winner to not get a majority. The Electoral College distorts a candidate's campaign strategy. The winner-take-all provision in all but 2 states put a premium on a few large competitive states. Would we choose the Electoral College again if we started all over? It'll probably never be changed. The most presidential campaigns are led by an amateur. If you have a nationally prestigious chairperson who serves as an advisor, but the real work is being done by the professional staff the candidate hires. Some jobs include not only the well-known ones of like campaign managers and strategists, but also the specialized components tailored to the modern campaign's emphasis on information and money. There's something called oppo research, opposition research. It's the investigation of an opponent's background for the purpose of exploiting weaknesses and undermining credibility. I did that for one campaign cycle, and it was a really difficult job to have to spend so much time digging up bad things about people. A modern campaign, though, needs to be able to control the flow of information, so oppo research has become a central part of campaigns. Contributing to the negative campaigning that is so prevalent in recent years. Candidates also need advanced teams to plan and prepare their travel agendas. They have staff devoted to fundraising. They need a legal team to keep their campaigns in compliance. They have campaign consultants who are able to provide specialized technical services. And then you present your candidate. An effective campaign begins with a clear understanding of how the candidate's strength fits with the context of the times and the mood of the voters on which the campaign narrative is built. The Obama campaign controlled the narrative with an unprecedented use of technology, this massive and well-organized volunteer component. There was a strategic effort needed to frame the narrative of the election as a choice between two candidates offering very different visions for America, rather than as a referendum on the presidency. The issues matter to voters as they decide how to vote. There are two kinds of issues to consider when planning a strategy: valence issues and position issues. A valence issue is an issue where most voters and candidates share the same position: motherhood and apple pie issues, because nobody opposes them. Everyone is for a strong, prosperous country, for America being respected around the world, fighting terrorism, thrift in government, a clean environment. We all oppose crime, drug abuse, political waste, political corruption, immorality. And then you have position issues. These are issues on which parties differ in their perspectives and propose solutions. There are two sides. Like abortion, there is pro-life and pro-choice. Most candidates have hard decisions to make on position issues. A clear stance means they make some friends, but they also gain some enemies. Realistic candidates try to avoid being clearly identified with the losing side of important issues. When a candidate does take a stand on a difficult political issue, a position issue, the other side often uses it against them as what's called a wedge issue, a controversial issue that one party uses to split the voters in the other party. Issue ownership is the tendency of one party to be seen as more competent in a specific area. This helps clarify the roles of policy issues in a presidential campaign. Valence issues are safe, so candidates stress them often, and they also focus on position issues that their party owns. So the real campaign is about which issues should be considered. The media makes it impossible to understand. It is impossible to understand the modern political campaign without appreciating the role of the media. We have 24-hour news stations, talk radio, the internet, countless narrators of current events. It's up to the campaign to try to manage that incredible flow of information and control the story. There are two kinds of information: the kind that you pay for and have some control over, and the kind you don't. Campaign ads are paid for. Advertising provides usable information for voters. And then social media campaigns, you don't have to pay to get the message in front of others, and you can go viral and share across the internet, but things also can be created by anyone, which can help establish or reinforce the narrative on which voters base their choice of candidates. Then you have something called negative advertising, which is campaign advertising that emphasizes the negative characteristics of opponents rather than one's own strength. This may turn off some voters, and it gives the perception that politics is an unpleasant business. But as long as it doesn't go too far, these ads register more quickly and are remembered more frequently and longer by voters than positive ads. Campaign coverage is expensive, so a campaign's goal is to maximize opportunities for free coverage while controlling as much as possible the kind of coverage that it gets. But now that there's a cell phone in every pocket, a recorded gaffe can quickly go viral and before any damage control can occur. Since 1976, presidential debates have become one of the major focal points of the campaign. There was the first televised debate that happened in 1960 between JFK and Nixon. The younger and more photogenic JFK came out ahead, of course, but those who heard it on the radio thought that Nixon did a better job. Leading candidates find it less in their interest to participate in debates because they have more to lose and less to win. So for years, they take place on a sporadic basis. Money. Winning or losing a presidential campaign involves serious money. In 2016, there was over $1 billion supplemented by PAC spending. There is something called a government matching fund, which is money given by the federal government to qualified presidential candidates in the primary and general election campaigns, which comes from citizens who check the box on their tax returns that sends money $3 to fund a presidential election campaign. The idea is to more easily regulate big money influence on campaigns. But Obama hasn't participated, and since then, a lot of campaigns have opted out of this. There's something called hard money, which is a campaign fund donated directly to a candidate, and amounts are limited by federal election laws. Money given by individuals, PACs, political parties, and the government, PAC being Political Action Committee. And then there's something called soft money, which is unregulated campaign contributions by individuals, groups, or parties that promote general election activities but don't directly support individual candidates. Get out the vote drives, party building efforts. Issue advocacy ads or advertisements paid for by soft money and thus not regulated, and that promote certain issue positions but don't endorse specific candidates. Get out the vote drives, GOTV. These are efforts by political parties and interest groups that get a candidate's staff out to maximize voter turnout among supporters. I've done this as well. It's a volunteer thing that you can do. I actually just got an email from a local political party that they're trying to have a GOTV drive in the Columbia mayoral race right now. Voter mobilization efforts. They're just, you're trying to go knock on doors, trying to get people to show up to the polls. In the 80s and 90s, it was the air wars on TV, trying to get people to show up. In 2012, Obama had kind of a reawakening in direct contact, and we really started knocking on doors. Both political parties started knocking on doors again. Interpreting elections. So after the election is over, votes are counted, and we know who has won, but it seems the election season is over, but it needs interpretation, and probably the most important interpretation is the one articulated by the victor. The winning candidate claims an electoral mandate, the perception that an election victory signals broad support for the winner's proposed policies. The kind of narrative that the people want the president to do the things he has campaigned on, and the election is about the voters' preference for the presidential leadership and his policy. The losing party is going to also try to argue that this loss was due to characteristics of its candidate or a specific campaign mistake. Party members are going to resist the interpretation that voters rejected their measures and visions for the narrative for the nation. Congress responds more to indications and changes in public preferences signaled by a change in which a party wins presidency over or a large legislative seat turnover, and the media is going to develop a narrative about it as well. In 2016, it was that both candidates were unlikable. The campaign was negative, exhausting, and issue-free. So, do too many informed voters lead to too much conflict? The American citizen is nothing like the ideal citizen of classic democratic theory. But does this mean we're doomed to undemocratic failure? We've discussed three models of citizen activity in democracies. The elite model: as citizens, we can do no more or are fit to do more than choose among the elites who govern us, making a rather passive choice from among remote leaders. Then we have the pluralist model. We participate in political life primarily through our affiliation with different types of groups. And then we have the participatory model. We grow and develop as citizens through being politically active. But an American citizen's role in elections seems to borrow elements from all three models in a way that might be called the fourth model. American citizens make a difference in American politics through the mechanism of elections. Is there a fourth model? Early studies of voting show most citizens have surprisingly low levels of interest in presidential campaigns. People are going to vote according to the groups where they belong. Democratic policy is actually better off when it has lots of different types of citizens. Some who care deeply and are highly informed and participate intensely. Some who are moderately informed, and some who are less aware of politics until some great issue or controversy takes place. If we are involved enough, do the elections we participate make any difference? Should they represent the voice of the people in charting the directions for government policy? Elections do achieve electoral accountability. By having to stand for re-election, our leaders are more or less constantly concerned with the consequences of what they do for their next election. We tend to vote retrospectively. How are things going? So this provides incumbents with a lot of incentive to keep things running properly. Do elections matter in terms of who wins? Yeah, of course. Parties stand on opposite sides of many issues, and given the chance, they will move national policy in the direction they believe in. For example, electing a Democrat is going to result in a more liberal policy. Electing a Republican is going to result in a more conservative policy. But not all citizens know what they want, and not all candidates can respond to this. But policy does follow elections. Citizens can and do change what the government does through the ballot, So vote, guys, vote. It's so important. All right, sorry for the long lecture, and thanks for hanging in. One more lecture to go. See you guys next week.